The first thing Millionaire CEO Elara Voss noticed that morning was the janitor running toward her across the marble lobby. Not walking. Not hurrying. Running. His cleaning cart was abandoned behind him, one hand raised urgently as he crossed the bright glass atrium of Voss Meridian Technologies. Elara had spent 20 years building a company where people waited for her permission before speaking. Yet now a quiet janitor she barely remembered seeing was telling her to stop. And then he pointed toward the massive glass doors behind her. Elara turned. For one terrifying second, she saw nothing unusual. Then the janitor grabbed her attention again and motioned for her to follow him. Seconds later, the entire lobby erupted in confusion. If you believe that kindness can create second chances when people least expect them, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Little Kindness Tales. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to life. The man leading Elara away was named Jonah Mercer, a 38-year-old single father who worked as a daytime janitor at the company. He had been there for nearly 3 years, arriving before sunrise and leaving just before his daughter came home from school. Most executives barely noticed him. To them, Jonah was simply the man who kept fingerprints off the glass, emptied wastebaskets, polished conference tables, and quietly disappeared whenever important meetings began. But Jonah noticed everything. He noticed which executives skipped breakfast because they were too busy. He noticed which assistants cried in empty conference rooms. He noticed when employees were afraid to speak. And most importantly, he noticed the building itself, the sounds it made, the doors that stuck, the elevators that behaved strangely, and the small warning signs most people ignored because they were too distracted to care. Jonah had learned to pay attention because life had taught him that ignoring small problems could create enormous ones. 3 years earlier, his wife had passed away unexpectedly, leaving him alone to raise their 8-year-old daughter, Mira. Jonah had struggled badly at first. There were hospital bills, rent, school expenses, and nights when he sat at the kitchen table wondering how he could possibly keep everything together. He could not afford to fall apart because Mira still needed breakfast in the morning, clean clothes for school, and someone waiting when she came home. So he took the janitorial job. It was not glamorous, but it was honest. Every afternoon, Jonah picked Mira up from school and listened to her talk about books, science projects, and the little things that made her laugh. He had learned that being a good father was not about having everything. It was about making sure your child never doubted that they mattered. Meanwhile, Elara Voss lived in an entirely different world. At 44, she was one of the most successful technology executives in the city. Her company occupied a 20-story tower, and financial magazines regularly called her one of the most powerful women in business. She owned a beautiful home, traveled constantly, and could solve a $1 million problem with one phone call. But behind the polished image was a woman who had slowly become isolated. Elara trusted numbers more than people. Numbers did not betray you. Contracts did not suddenly change their minds. Business plans did not leave without explaining why. That morning, Elara had arrived for the most important meeting of the year. A group of investors was coming to discuss a massive expansion that could take her company into international markets. Losing the deal could cost hundreds of millions of dollars and force the company to abandon months of preparation. She entered the building shortly after 10 in the morning, surrounded by assistants and security personnel. And then Jonah saw something that made his stomach tighten. Near the eastern entrance, one of the building's large glass panels had begun vibrating slightly. Most people would never notice it. Jonah did. He had heard that strange sound before. A faint metallic clicking. The previous afternoon, he had reported a loose support bracket to the facilities department. He had been told it would be inspected later because the building was busy. But now the vibration was stronger. Jonah looked upward. The panel was directly above the place where Elara had stopped to speak with her assistant. He dropped the cleaning cloth in his hand and ran. Elara initially thought someone was trying to get her attention about a routine problem. She almost continued walking. Then Jonah's expression changed. There was no fear for himself in his face. There was fear for her. He motioned urgently toward the side corridor. Elara followed him. They had barely moved several steps when a sharp metallic sound echoed through the lobby. A large decorative section attached to the entrance structure suddenly broke loose and crashed onto the area where Elara had been standing moments earlier. People screamed and rushed backward. Security officers moved toward the entrance. Assistants froze. Several employees stared at the fallen structure in disbelief. Elara stood completely still. She looked at Jonah. He was breathing heavily. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The woman who was accustomed to controlling entire boardrooms suddenly realized that a man most executives never bothered to notice had just saved her from standing beneath a dangerous falling structure. But Jonah did not wait for praise. Instead, he immediately turned toward the entrance and began helping people move away from the area. That was when Elara noticed something else. Jonah's hands were shaking. Not because he was frightened for himself. Because he had a daughter waiting for him after work. Later that afternoon, Elara asked her assistant to find out everything about him. What she discovered surprised her. Jonah had never complained about his salary. He had never asked for special treatment. He had never used his difficult circumstances as an excuse to avoid work. His attendance record was nearly perfect. But there was one note in his employee file that stopped Elara cold. Jonah had recently requested a schedule adjustment because his daughter had been struggling at school after losing her mother. The request had been denied. Elara stared at the screen for a long time. She remembered seeing Jonah in the hallways dozens of times. She had never once asked his name. That realization bothered her more than she expected. The next morning, Elara found Jonah cleaning the executive floor. She approached him without an entourage. He looked surprised. She thanked him. Jonah simply nodded and returned to polishing the glass. But Elara noticed something different about him. He did not seem proud of what he had done. He seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. When she asked why he had acted so quickly, Jonah explained that he had noticed the same structural sound the previous day and had reported it. Nobody had treated the warning seriously. That sentence stayed with Elara. Because she realized the problem was not that Jonah had saved her. The problem was that someone had warned them, and nobody had listened. Elara ordered an immediate inspection of the entire building. The results were disturbing. Several maintenance issues had been postponed because managers wanted to avoid disrupting business operations. Employees had reported problems that never reached senior leadership. Safety concerns had been buried under paperwork. Elara was furious. But instead of blaming everyone beneath her, she did something unexpected. She admitted that she had helped create the culture. She had built a company where results were celebrated more loudly than people were heard. From that day forward, things began changing. The maintenance department received proper resources. Employees were encouraged to report concerns without fear. Elara began walking through the building herself instead of staying inside executive offices. And she started talking to people. Not just managers. Everyone. One afternoon, she saw Jonah sitting outside the company cafeteria with Mira. Mira was doing homework while Jonah ate a simple sandwich. Elara recognized the little girl from a photograph in Jonah's employee file. She sat nearby and asked Mira about school. Mira immediately began talking about a science project involving renewable energy. Elara listened. For the first time in years, she found herself enjoying a conversation that had nothing to do with business. Jonah watched quietly. He could see something changing in Elara. She was still powerful. Still wealthy. Still the CEO. But she was becoming human again. Weeks passed. The company secured its international expansion deal, but Alara made sure Jonah received recognition for the safety warning that had protected hundreds of people. She also created a new employee assistance program that helped workers facing family emergencies, childcare problems, and financial difficulties. When Jonah's daughter needed additional support at school, the program helped his family. But perhaps the most meaningful change happened on a completely ordinary afternoon. Alara was walking through the lobby when she saw Jonah helping an elderly delivery worker carry several heavy boxes. He had no reason to do it. Nobody was watching. There was no camera. No executive nearby. Jonah simply saw someone struggling and stepped forward. Alara smiled. She finally understood something she had spent years forgetting. Success was not measured by how many people stood when you entered a room. It was measured by how many people were willing to stand beside you when life became difficult. Months later, Alara invited Jonah and Mira to a company family celebration. Mira wore a simple blue dress and proudly showed Alara a science project she had completed. Jonah stood nearby, watching his daughter laugh. Alara looked at them and remembered that morning in the lobby. A millionaire CEO had believed she was the most important person in the building. A single dad janitor had shown her otherwise. Sometimes the person who changes your life is not the person sitting in the corner office. Sometimes it is the person holding a mop. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply paying attention when everyone else is too busy to notice. And sometimes a second chance does not begin with money, power, or success. It begins when one person finally decides to see another person. Jonah never became a millionaire. He never wanted to. What he gained was something far more important to him, a stable life for Mira, respect for his work, and the knowledge that his quiet kindness had mattered. Alara gained something too. She learned to slow down. To listen. To notice. And whenever she walked through the bright lobby of Voss Meridian Technologies, she remembered the morning a janitor had told a millionaire CEO to follow him, and how those few seconds changed the way she saw everyone around her. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes that every person deserves to be seen, and subscribe to Little Kindness Tales for more emotional stories about kindness, courage, and second chances. Before you leave, comment, "Kindness is always worth it." Because you never know when a small act of kindness, given quietly and without expecting anything in return, might become the very thing that changes someone else's life.